Hello everyone, welcome back. This is an episode that I'm really excited about. This is one of my signature series. This is a process I've been developing for a very long time and trying to get the best way to approach every scene. I call the chapter Just a Picture Syndrome because it's the thing that us as photographers find hardest to break away from. Breaking away from taking just a picture of what's in front of you, the mechanical copy of what's just in front of you. As artists in our own right, we want to create more than just a picture. We want it to have an emotional impact. We want it to be powerful. We want it to stop people. So these are a few guidelines I've created to help a photographer with any scene that's in front of them decide what is the most powerful way to create an image out of this, how to avoid taking just a picture. Enjoy. So I'm sure you can all agree that we want to induce some sort of emotion when we look at an image. We want it to be powerful. We want it to draw our viewer in. We want our viewer to be connected. We want them to stay. We want to stop them when scrolling Instagram. We want to stop them in a hallway. We want them to go wow when they look at it. We can't do this if we just take a picture of a scene. Now in art, as we've spoken about before, it's a very subjective subject. Some people are moved by some images and some people are moved by other images. So you can never have rules in this game, rules on how to avoid just taking a picture and how to create art, because there is no rules. It's a completely liquid subject. It's different for everyone. But here's some guidelines that I use every time I go into a scene. I consider these 4 aspects. And in using these guidelines over the years, I've found I've started to create much more powerful images and much more consistently. The first one we're going to talk about is composition versus detail. Now, there's a lot of detail freaks out there that are going to challenge me on this and say, it's all about detail. If your subject's not sharp, then the image is a steaming pile of hippo shit. Damn motorbikes. What was I on? I said something about hippo shit. And yes, those detail freaks are not wrong. It is important to have detail on your subject as much as you can. But too often, great pieces of work are tossed into the bin because they don't have detail. They're not sharp enough for me. When actually an image's true power, its essential nature lies in its composition. I've always stressed a composition makes and breaks an image. And I like to stress an example. If we look at paintings that have lasted the ages, Starry Night, Mona Lisa, these are paintings. There's not massive amounts of detail. Mona Lisa has quite a lot of detail in it, but cameras can capture more these days. They can capture the most minute details. But those paintings, especially Starry Night, it wasn't about detail, it was about emotion, it was about composition. That's what the artists concentrated on most. They wanted to induce emotion and they didn't need detail to do it. So we should apply that to our photography too. Try and get the most detailed image possible, but where it's not possible, don't be afraid of using that image anyway, because its beauty might lie simply in its composition and that detail does not matter. And detail, you might not have a choice, especially when you approach a scene in wildlife and there's a lot of heat and distance between you and your subject. There's a lot of heat haze or dust, or you have a shitty camera and a shitty lens and it doesn't capture as much detail as you like. Don't despair, because if you're clever with your composition, a composition trumps detail every single time. So you can still outdo any photographer with tens of thousands of dollars of equipment who has sloppy compositions in their work. You will create more powerful, more emotional work. And this goes into post-processing too. Too often we can't get close enough, even with a zoom lens, and we're too far out and our subject is lost in the frame. And the photographer refuses to crop in, sometimes even crop in a little bit. And often that image is thrown into the trash, whereby cropping in, sometimes drastically cropping in, there's a beautiful composition there, a beautiful frame, and that image comes to life and you've created a beautiful piece of work. So when you come into a scene and you might think you're not close enough or you can't manage with the equipment that you have, know that a strong composition will always trump detail. So take the picture, even if you know you're going to crop drastically in later and there's not going to be a lot of detail left over. If the composition is sound, you can still create a beautiful piece of work. The next thing we're going to talk about, and this is one of the most important things I apply to every single scene that I might photograph in the wild, in streets, with regard to nature, with regard to tribesmen, whatever genre of photography that I'm applying at the time, this is probably the most important guideline, and it's minimalism. Now, a lot of people think minimalism to be a small subject, big skies. Quite often it's applied to images of the Masai Mara or the Serengeti, a topee on a ridge, huge skies, lots of grass, a tiny elephant, massive, big, dramatic skies. Now, that's not untrue, as that is minimalism. But minimalism doesn't end there. Its true power and its true guideline lies in its actual definition, which is the elimination of non-essential elements, getting rid of non-essential elements. So what I do every time I get into a scene, and this helps me so often, is I decide what I want in the scene and what I don't want in the scene, and I do my best to get rid of what I don't want. Now sometimes it's quite difficult to decide what you don't want in the scene because there's often a plethora of objects and characters that you might not want in the scene that are non-essential. But an easier way to look at it is decide what you want in the frame, as usually there's only a few things that you do want in there. And by identifying those things, you can quite easily identify what you don't want, which is the rest of the objects or characters inside that scene. And once you can see what you want in the frame, it's much easier to maneuver and position yourself as best as possible, where you take an image with only essential elements or as close to that as possible, and you've simplified the image, which means nothing is going to be distracting your viewer. So having a minimalistic approach to your photography is really one of the greatest guidelines you can ever have, removing non-essential elements. The next thing we talk about is confrontation and engagement. Now don't mix this up with the idea that your subject is always going to be confronting you. There's some unethical photographers out there, but that's not what we're talking about at the moment. We want our viewer to be confronted or engaged with the image, and we've got to decide how to do that in the scene. And more often than not, this is avoided because the photographer themselves doesn't engage with the scene. And what I mean by that is we often rush and we get into a moment and we just start taking pictures instead of understanding what's going on. With that understanding, we get a clearer picture of the emotion or the power that we want the image to have. It might mean getting closer to your subject and understanding the terrain, and therefore when you take a picture of that, that's communicated through your image. If the leopard you're photographing is too small in the frame and gets lost in the image, it doesn't own the frame. I always come back to this. Your subject, no matter how small it is, has got to own the frame. A leopard could be tiny in your frame and on a ridge, but its profile is clear. Your viewer is engaged with it, understands it. So when I'm in a scene, and it might be full of obscure objects, I ask myself, how am I going to engage my viewer with the subject? Now, those obscure objects are not my subject. My leopard's my subject. So it might mean moving around or zooming in or cutting out non-essential elements, spoken about minimalism before. But the point is to get by things that make it an obscure story, hard to read story. Your viewer's got to be engaged. Sometimes we can apply this to the actual posture and position of our subject themselves. Not too often photographers say that your subject needs to be looking straight down the lens. This is not necessarily true. Great images can have the subject looking either way, sometimes even looking away from the camera. But in many scenes, having a little bit of eye contact or being able to see a lot of the eye, even if it's not looking directly at the photographer, will help the viewer engage with your subject. If it's looking down like this or looking at the side, compared to looking at you, you feel much more engaged. Now, like I said, this is a guideline because there's great images with the subject looking the opposite direction to the photographer. These are just the guidelines. When the subject's looking towards you or in your general direction, know that eye contact or being able to contact your viewer with the eyes is going to make a more engaging and more powerful image. The last thing we look at is perspective. This is the last guideline I use when I enter a scene. The things I ask myself on how to get the best image out of the scenario. And when we talk about perspective, we're talking about the way we look upon our subject, because that's going to be translated through our image. The most common mistake of this, especially in wildlife photography, we're often in jeeps or game viewers and we see a lion or we see a leopard and we drive right up to it and we start taking pictures. What happens? You're high in a jeep, you're looking down on your subject. That's what I mean about perspective, is how we look upon our subject. What that happens, it does a number of things. One, it destroys your depth of field and you get details in the grass all around your subject. And you've added loads of non-essential elements to the frame because all those details have become evident. So a better image would have been driving back, getting further away, getting a lower angle. What these angles do is if you look up at your subject, you're giving your subject emphasis. Even if you look at eye level to your subject, it's just as good. Sometimes not as good, sometimes better. But if your subject is level or above your viewer's gaze in the image or in the scene, you're giving importance to your subject. If it's a lion, your lion is important. It's a magnificent animal. You don't want to be looking down on it. That takes away emphasis from your subject. You want to be looking up at the lion or looking straight at it. That's the story. You want to give glory to this lion. Now, this doesn't mean that in every image you have to look eye level to your subject or look up to your subject. Different angles mean different things. So if we're shooting wildlife, usually it's better if we're looking up. Usually, not every time. Remember, there's always exceptions to these rules, but usually it's better if we're looking eye level or looking up towards our subject because we want to give it the glory it deserves. However, looking down on your subject does evoke different emotions. If we want our viewer to pity the subject, not be in awe of the subject, then a downward angle would be a much more powerful perspective if those are the emotions you want to evoke. A hungry child if you're a journalist, or a sad child for whatever reasons you're taking pictures of that for. If you want your viewer to have pity or a sense of remorse, then that downward angle might work. So that's perspective. That's the last guideline I use when I look into a scene, and how I make sure I don't come out of that scene with just a picture. Now, these guidelines sometimes can always apply, sometimes only one of them. But I assure you, when you come into a scene and you ask yourself, what's the best composition here, regardless of detail that you might lose? And then you ask yourself, what do you want in the scene? And by doing that, you realize what you don't want in the scene, and you position yourself to cut out those non-essential elements as best as possible. And then you see what's the best way to have your viewer engage with your subject, engage with the story that you're trying to tell. Fucking motorbike. And lastly, perspective. How you look on the scene, the angle in which you look at your viewer. Because remember, those different angles mean different things. If you want to emphasize and give glory to a subject, it would be better if it was eye level or above you. If you want your viewer to have different emotions of pity or remorse, then maybe a downward angle. If you apply those 4 things, I guarantee you, you're going to start coming out with some super powerful and emotional images. So that's just a picture syndrome, and that's how best to avoid taking just a picture in any scenario you might come in. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you for the next one.